Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works. All right, well, released earlier this fall, The Quiet Limit, a dystopic future. Trista Lundquist, the creator of that future, joins me on the show. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm curious, are you someone who reads a lot of dystopic fiction?
Yeah, I am. And I was a lot when I was younger as well. So it's something that's always really intrigued me, is those worlds that are, pretty out there and not what we live in, but are close enough that they could be probable, or have always piqued my interest.
So as a reader and looking at those probable futures that aren't our future right now, was there something about could you identify things that you could see conceivably, and then there's things that maybe are too far? Like as a reader, were you I'm not buying this one. I don't see us going there versus, this one I buy.
Do you mean in my book specifically, or
no? I mean, as a reader, were there things that you identified that was a bridge too far in terms of a created future?
Yeah, I feel like anything you go with sci-fi, as soon as you add a little bit of sci-fi in it, it can almost always be probable, right? Because we don't know where science is going. So I feel like that always creates kind of a bridge to something that might happen. It's when you start introducing magic and monsters and things, then it gets a little too far, which is still fun to read, but a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. So having read those, did you give some thought to kind of what was conceivable within the world you were creating? Were you conscious of this is maybe too far, or I buy this as a reader or as a creator?
Yeah, I have a really good friend who's actually a doctor. And so I talked to him a lot because when I was developing this world, and one of the big premises of the book is that everybody in the society knows how old they're going to be when they die, right? And so I called him up a lot and was like, I know this isn't probable, but if it were, could I say this? And I had a few times where he was like, I don't know. And then he started getting really into it and would send me articles. And so we went back and forth to find some, common links.
So had you been reading about the Human Genome Project and things like that, where they're trying to map, whether diseases are possible and stuff like that?
100%. Yeah.
So reading that, did that kind of spark your imagination about this topic?
A little bit. So the concept of this book came to me years and years and years ago. And it was, one of those, somebody passes away in your life and all the thoughts of mortality come to you, right? What if they had more time? What if we would have known? And so it kind of got the thought process going that what if everybody knew? And not just that, but how they'd be treated differently in society based on if everybody knew. And so that's kind of where the idea took off. And from there, I was like, oh, I guess we're going to have to do some research into scientifically what could happen here, which is where my, friend helped out a lot.
So someone in your own life had passed?
Pardon me, sorry?
Someone in your own life had passed, and that?
Yeah.
And then that got you thinking about, mortality in a creative way. Was that a way to deal with the loss and the grieving process?
It might have been. And I think it's one of those things that we all as humans think about often. And, that age old question, right? Would you want to know if you could know? And like I was saying, what interested me the most of it, not just knowing, but how different the world would be if everybody knew, because it would definitely determine somebody's place within the world. If, you only had a short period of time, you wouldn't be seen as useful to society.
Right. And it gets into the larger question of, worth and, ascribing worth to a person rather than their own inherent value that they place on their own life. How much of that, did you conceive of beforehand, or did it come out in the writing?
The way I write is a lot, I have a great idea and I get super excited and I start throwing it down, on the keyboard, and then it kind of grows from there. And this book definitely grew from there. It started with that little idea. And then as the world developed, it became, sorry, I forgot the question. I started talking about
the question's around like, did you come with like a fundamental thought about like something like worth or like
Yeah.
like a
Oh,
human's like
100%.
inherent value and what they like feel themselves intrinsically
Yeah.
versus like what society places on them? And like, are you writing from a place of kind of like not necessarily like proselytizing on that idea, but like exploring that idea?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, 100%. That was that's where the book kind of came from, was that worth within this fictional futuristic society.
So your central character, like, do you think of her first? Like, is she your entry point to this story, or do you think about a society and then like who is the person I'm going to tell the story about this society through?
It it started with Lay because as I was saying, worth within this society based on lifespan. And so she was really interesting because I figured if this society that's taking place in the future where, a lot of disease, cancer, everything had been eradicated already, people would have really long lifespans because there wouldn't be a lot to worry about. And what if this person was born into the society that was completely different? And that was Lay, because she was born and told that she'd only live to be 18. And so the rest of the society is all, 100 years plus. And so it really interested me that journey she'd have within this community where she was so different.
The notion of like being like stamped from birth, like,
Yeah.
it's something that's in fiction and, in kind of the populace. Were you trying to kind of wrestle with that notion through Lay? Like putting someone who everyone has a specific kind of thought about like what her life is going to be like, or how it's going to end. Like, are you writing it from like her viewpoint on this, or are you looking at kind of the larger like macro of the society and how they look at a person like this? And like, are you trying to wrestle with some like larger picture issues when it comes to that?
Kind of. I mean, it started as her. And I think at the beginning of the book, it's very character driven. It's very, this is her, this is what she's dealing with. And then when things start to kind of get a little strange and she starts to notice things, it becomes more plot driven and it becomes more everything around her, and what she's believed her whole life is different. And there's all these misconceptions, right? So I think in a way it does deal with, obviously in a very fictional society, but something we all deal with, which is why I think it fits very well within, the young adult genre, is that idea of fitting in and feeling different and feeling like you don't belong, which is very much where she is.
Speaking of the young adult genre, like, do you think it's that like the character is a teenager that makes it a YA story, or like the way that it's treated is like, because I mean, I'm an adult man. I enjoyed this book.
Yeah.
I was wrestling with like why this is considered YA.
It's really funny. So I didn't define it as, I didn't go in thinking I'm writing a book for young adults, right? It just, I wrote it, and that's kind of the genre it fell into. The thing about YA that's so funny is now you say that, I have so many people who are, my parents' age in their 60s that are calling me and telling me they read it and they loved it. And I think there's something special about this genre, because when we all started reading and when we all became readers, we were in that, most of us in our teenage years, right? And so those books that we read when we were that age resonate a lot with us because they kind of give us that nostalgia. And I think a lot of YA has that coming of age, finding out who you are, which we all, start to realize when we're teenagers as well. It's kind of funny. I was reading something the other day. I think it was Judy Blume quoted. I hope I'm quoting this right. And she said, in order to write good young adult, you have to think back to what you liked when you were that age. And one of my absolute favorite books from when I was younger was The Giver. And a lot of those themes kind of came into this book as well. And that was a huge inspiration for The Quiet Limit. There's just so much that Lois Lowry does with creating a society that, like I was saying earlier, is purely fictional, but you look at little bits of the society and think, that could happen. And that's what makes it kind of freaky and interesting, right? And brings you into it.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking of, the one thing I could see as like a teenager is like, you versus society. Like that's a very like when you're a teenager, you're defining yourself in opposition to a lot of things, and so clearly Leigh is in that world.
And she's kind of on the edge too, right? She's turning 18 at the beginning, so more almost young adult, but in that in between period, which can be interesting as well.
You mentioned The Giver and like the world building that is in that book. In terms of building the world in The Quiet Limit, like how much like are you like writing down like this is kind of what the community looks like, or like building a map of the thing? Like how much like kind of pre-production are you doing when it comes to conceiving of the world that, you know, the action and the characters inhabit?
Yeah, I have a map. I actually drew a map because as I was describing things, I was saying to myself, okay, you can't forget that this is where this house is. It needs to be here. So yeah, it's funny because I have a map. I actually drew, I have a document that has like characters. Here's who they're related to, and here's this, just because it's a lot, right? And I didn't want to mess that up later on.
So then, like, as you're writing, do you find like, it's like, oh, wait a second, like I described her going a route that she couldn't go, and I have to go back to the map and like rewrite how I describe her action?
Yeah, that's kind of part of it. The map really did help.
Do you do something in terms of mapping, in terms of plotting? Like, did you write out kind of what story beats or things had to happen within the plot? Like, because you said early on it's character building, and then you get like much more plot focused as the book kind of moves along. Did you have to kind of map that out, or is that something you discovered as you were writing it?
Kind of a bit of both. I often go into writing just super excited with an idea, and you have to throw everything down. And then as I get into it, you know, a few chapters in, I have to step back and think, okay, you need some organization here because this is just going to go off the rails. So I feel like I do a bit of both. I do make notes of what's coming. I need this to happen in order for this to happen. My characters often have a mind of their own and they change things on me, but at least I have somewhere that I kind of want to go.
So when you say characters have a mind of their own and change things on you, can you give an example of like what happened that characters change things?
Yeah. Okay. So I went into this. I had no intention of having any sort of love story in this book at all. And then we got into a situation with Leigh and one of the characters where it just kind of developed. And as much as I tried to push it away and be like, I don't want this in here, this wasn't part of the story, it almost made less sense not to have it as the story progressed. So that was one of those kind of funny things that I actually really enjoyed about it in the end, but I did not plan on that one bit happening.
No, and not planning on that happening, was that like a rebellion against like romance in fiction, or just like... No,
I don't think it was a rebellion against that at all. I think it just, so much happens in this story that I didn't know if there was room for it. And I wanted to keep it about her. I didn't want, you know, the boy coming in and saving the day, which, I mean, I'm not giving any spoilers, but I was trying to stay away from that. But I do like how it turned out. So I'm happy with that rebellion.
How much thought did you give to keeping this book like tight? Like it is, pretty, like it moves very quickly, and it's, a contained thing. Like how conscious of you were you of that? And like, how was that like editing in the afterwards? Like you wrote it and then you're like, oh, I need to like pare down to like keep this tight.
I honestly, when I was in editing, I didn't pare it down that much. We actually added more in editing than taking away, adding more like little bits here and there to make things a little more robust. But I think this is the first book that I've actually finished, and I was so happy to get there. And I was so excited about the storyline that I guess it just kind of, it came out really quickly. What I've been writing since has been much longer. So I think it was just the excitement of the story that I wanted to get it out. I didn't want too much fat in there to clog things up, for lack of better terms.
Adding things in the editing process, like, did you identify areas where you like were too too brisk, like that you needed to expand on things? Like what were you editing, and how were you flagging that as something that needed to happen?
That was my editor. Yeah, that there were a few points in the story where she really liked what was the moment that was happening and wanted more. So she had flagged a few pieces that she's like, I like this. I want more tension. So add more. And we added a little more instances of just, repercussions of things that happen to people within the community when things don't go as expected. So just a little more world building and adding more tension to scenes here and there.
I was going to ask you about the world building, because you said, you start from character, right? Like Leigh, and in the early on, you're trying to build her character. How conscious are you of like incorporating or familiarizing the reader with like where Leigh lives to give you a sense of who she is? Like, how do you kind of explore a new world that you're building through this person that you're introducing and kind of marry the two?
I think a lot early on is through her interactions with other characters and where they are and what they're doing in their lives. And I mean, you see her family, she's super close with her family and their job and where it takes them. So it's kind of following her through her days within this community and building the community around her. The one lucky thing for me is the community she lives in is very small, and they all believe that, they're all that's left of society. So at least I'm not having to explore, an entire world. It's this very small, few hundred people, close-knit, utopian community.
You say she's super close with her family. However, there is tension with her brother.
Yeah.
Like the sibling tension, was that just something you wanted to explore as a dynamic, or did that like help create kind of like a little bit of narrative to have, her brother on the inside and her on the outside?
I think it helped create a lot of narrative, because her brother Lev is very, he wants to be doing what's expected of him. And she's the disappointment of the family, because he's a prodigy, basically. He's born to do great things with a high, his year of death is much, much, much later than hers. And then she comes along and kind of ruins this for him. And so that back and forth between them is something that I think really shaped the differences of the characters within this community head on.
Are you building like a character map when you first write? Like this person has this attributes, or, I need a person who does X. So who are they and what do they embody? Like, how do you determine, like the cast?
I knew in the example of her older brother. And so Leigh has the older brother who she has this tension with. And then she has her younger brother who's much younger than her and just that she's very close with. And I really liked that dynamic within their family, because I was able to show, the harder side of Lev wanting to fit in, wanting to do what's expected of him, wanting to stay in line. And then Hugo, the younger brother, who's just, childish innocence and doesn't even understand where he is or what's happening yet. And then Leigh kind of caught in the middle. And as far as the other supporting cast of characters, a lot of them, I did know I wanted a friend. We needed someone that cared about her, right? Because she was in such a tough spot. But a lot of them kind of developed as the story went along.
So having a friend, like, did you need her as like a sounding board, or someone who Leigh could like externalize her thoughts so that you didn't always have to write like an internal monologue for Leigh?
Exactly. Yeah, it was a good way to get, exactly like you're saying, her thoughts out there. And it also, her friend Evra was, it made her more human, I feel, because if Evra wasn't there, I feel like it would have been a really depressing book early on with her just wallowing in her own self-pity. But Evra kind of gave her this ability to be real, to be human, and to kind of step away from everything for a little while.
Like the tone you mentioned, not avoiding a depressing book. Were you conscious of like, this is a heady topic. This is, like a society that's kind of bleak. Like how do you make that interesting or fun? Like how much thought goes into that?
100%, because I mean, I started off by talking about, what would you know, how would you feel if you knew it when you die, right? And so I didn't want it. I said I wanted it to be an enjoyable read still, and so I was very conscious of trying to find ways to add some happiness to it. And I think Hugo was a good part of that, the little brother. I have little boys that I took a lot of his character from, and he was a lot of fun to write. And it's funny, I had somebody who just finished reading my book mentioned to me the other day, she's like, it was really dark, but I loved it. It's like, well, that's good then. I mean, you can like it being dark as long as there's those glimmers of light and hope here and there.
Right, like a book like The Giver or any other YA like that. The title itself is taken from a Alfred Lord Tennyson quote that you actually mention in the book, right? Like not every book has the title within the text, but you do that. Did you find the Tennyson quote early on and decide to incorporate that, or was that something that kind of came out in the writing?
Well, so okay, first of all, as a reader, I think we can all agree when we find the title of the book within the actual text of the book, we all get a little bit excited because it's kind of fun, right? It's like,
For sure.
Yes,
Easter egg, yeah.
Exactly. So the way I got that quote from the poem, I had actually written more than half of the book and it still didn't have a title, and it was driving me absolutely crazy because I'd go in to work on it and I was loving the story. I was so proud of how it was coming along, but I had nothing to call it. And at that point I was like, no, I need to figure this out. And so I love poetry. I'm super inspired by poetry. I often find it's a great way to see these huge themes built up in such a small context. And so I started just browsing poetry on mortality, just doing searches, and I came across Tithonus, the poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson, and I loved it. It was awesome because it talks about immortality in a really interesting way, from positive to negative, and a lot of the tone of the poem kind of reflected in the book, and I loved it, and I found the title of the book is from that poem. And it felt, wrong not to put the poem in there, because if somebody reads it and really likes poetry as well, they might get a few hints of what's to come as well.
So, were you Google searching mortality plus poem?
Yeah, mortality poetry. Let's go.
Were there any other poems that kind of spoke to you, but you didn't end up using, or was it just the perfection of this that stanza about here at the quiet limit of the world?
This was one of the first. It was about a year or two back, so I don't remember if there were any others, but this was one of the first ones. And yeah, I really liked the name. It really resonated with me.
Now, the book, we're not going to spoil anything, but there is an open ending to this book where conceivably there is more to this story.
Mm-hmm.
Did you write that purposefully, or did you already think about if there's something next? I have an idea for it.
Originally, I, as a reader, I like a book with a somewhat open ending. I hate it when things are packaged, tied with bows, and here's everything explained, you're done. I always like to leave a book with some still thinking about it. And I feel like leaving the ending slightly open lets you continue to think about it and make your own conclusions about what might happen next. And with this book, I thought it's funny. I thought I closed it up enough that it was done. And it was my editor originally who came back to me, and she's like, so when's the next one coming? I'm like, what? She's like, I want to know what happens next. And I told her I hadn't planned on writing anything after that. I thought it was a pretty good ending. And after chatting with her, I have kind of started dabbling on what would happen next.
Yeah, you mentioned writing this one quickly, and that subsequent writings haven't necessarily been as fast. Is it that story, or is it completely separate writing that you're writing at a slower pace?
No, it after this one, after she said that, it's what would come after this one for sure. Okay,
so then in terms of, you've built one world.
Yeah.
Conceiving of that on a grander scale, does that create X number of more complexities for you as a writer?
It's been really fun. It's been a lot of fun because, as I said, this was one small community. And again, I don't want to spoil anything. It's kind of hard to talk about this book without spoiling
Yeah,
things,
yeah, no.
right? But yeah, thinking about, what else is there has been a really fun experiment.
Speaking of talking about this book without, spoiling things, when it comes to writing like a blurb on the back to like give people a taste of what the book is about, how much thought goes into like not showing your cards?
Yeah. And that's the thing, because it starts off with, what this society, right? And what I often tell people is, takes place within a society where everyone knows, when they're going to pass away, and then some things start happening. And that's kind of what I tell people. And they're like, well, what things? Like, well, I can't really tell you what things, but yeah, it's tough to describe the type of books where, you have to be very careful what you say.
Do you like appreciate that as a book? Like, because you're a reader,
Yeah.
like, do you appreciate when someone's like, oh, no, you just got to read it? Like, I can't tell you anymore.
I do. I like being surprised. I like being surprised. And I think a lot of readers are the same way.
Sure enough. Well, The Quiet Limit is out. We can't talk any more about it as we're out of time, but also it would spoil the book. Trista, congratulations on the release of it, and thanks for taking some time to join me on the show.
Thanks so much, Michael.